If you love the Lord this morning, this is a great song to just worship Him. Shout it to the highest mountains that we can shout. How great He is. My Jesus, my Savior, Lord, there is none like You. All of my days, I want to praise the wonders of Your mighty love. My comfort, my shelter, tower of refuge and strength, let every breath, all that I am, never cease to worship You. Shout to the Lord on the earth, let us sing. Power and majesty, praise to the King. Mountains bow down and the seas will roar at the sound of Your name. I sing for joy in the work of Your hands. Forever I'll love You, forever I'll stand. Nothing compares to the promise I have in You. We have been in a series called The Meaning of Life. And we started out to ask that question, what is the meaning of life? And what we've already discovered, Solomon gives us that answer right off the bat. And he tells us, and he shows us, as we've already followed, when we try to live our life without God, when we try to live our life under the sun without God, then we're going to have problems without God. And we have looked at all kinds of different things that Solomon is reflecting back on. He's looking back over his shoulder. He's looking at life. And he gives us this wisdom, this knowledge that is in front of us. The book of Ecclesiastes, as we've said, is a book of regrets. Solomon is older in his age now. He's been through life. There was a time when he had God in his life, but he got away from that. And he tried to live his life on his own. And now he writes down, he journals for us. And that's the way I like to look at this book. It's almost like Solomon's journal. As he reflects back on his life and he says, hey, here's the mistakes I made. And here's what you can do to correct them. So what we've covered already in our series is basically in chapters 1 and 2. Solomon is sharing with us life under the sun, a life without God. And as I've already said, it's like problems without God. Because Ecclesiastes chapter 3, which J.D. shared with you earlier so beautifully, it presents to you and I something that is totally the opposite of what we've been covering in chapters 1 and 2. Because now, as one writer claims, this is going to cover problems with God. So we've been covering problems without God, and now we're going to look at chapter 3, and we're going to see problems with God. And a lot of people say we have problems with God. Well, think about it for just a moment. That has been argued throughout the centuries. Scholars, writers, they've written about Ecclesiastes chapter 3. They've written about problems with God. And I was reading back in one of David Jeremiah's books that I love. It's a journal that David Jeremiah wrote as he was going through his bout with cancer. And David Jeremiah was a mentor to me, and as he was going through that illness and fighting cancer and fighting for his life, he began to journal down his thoughts. Now, there's sometimes when problems arise in our lives that we go the opposite with God. We get mad at God. We get angry with God. We turn our backs on God. But what we're talking about is problems with God. Is God over everything in our lives? Is he over the good? Is he over the bad? Why does God allow this to happen? Why does God allow that to happen? And these are questions that we ponder in our minds constantly because we're human. But as I was going back and reading The Bend in the Road from David Jeremiah, I want to read this section from his pages of his journal, and I want to quote it for you. And I quote, "I know all about the problem with God. A few years ago, I encountered a life-threatening cancer, a life-changing adventure. I would not have chosen cancer as a path to spiritual growth, nor would I wish such fear and pain on anyone. On the other hand, I don't see my illness as a random event, some miscellaneous accident of health. And I don't believe there was a moment when God was absent from the physical and the emotional and spiritual crisis that I endured." David Jeremiah goes on to say, "In fact, I found him everywhere during that time. I found him as never before. I glimpsed his face among the doctors and nurses who cared for me so skillfully. I saw him there in shining power among the family of my church and intimately among the family circle of my wife and children. He met me in the private chapel of my soul, where with each passing day I felt deeper in his grace and comfort. At one bend of the road after another, I found my Lord more present and more powerful in my life. Knowing must be pain and suffering for us all, I dearly wish everyone could travel the road that I did. I wish every soul could see the face of God in the fear and turmoil. End of quote. Isn't that powerful? What was David Jeremiah saying to us today? He's making a point of Romans 8:28. That all things work together for good to them that love God and are called according to his purpose. That's what he's bringing up. He's saying, even in my deepest moment of pain and suffering, and even my deepest moment of fear, I felt God more in my life than I've ever experienced him before. You see, there are those that are out there that are trying to argue that God can't be all loving and all powerful. They don't believe that he can be both of those. They believe if he's all loving, he can't be all powerful. Even one rabbi said when his 3-year-old son was diagnosed with a rare disease and he passed away at 3 years of age, this rabbi said, he said, I knew God, I knew about God, I looked at God the way I looked at him until this happened, and after this happened, I look at God totally different now. And he said, I never prayed for my son's healing, because how can an all-loving God who created such a beautiful thing allow him to die? He must not be all-powerful. And that is his words. And I thought about that. Totally the opposite of where David Jeremiah was in his bout with cancer and where this rabbi was. And maybe you're here today and maybe you're facing these same fears. Maybe you've gone through some tragedies in your life. Well, this chapter right here explains it all to us. And that's what Solomon wants to do. He wants to bring out that Solomon would not agree of that assessment of that rabbi or anybody else who thinks that. Solomon helps us to understand that we do have an almighty God. Amen. Who we believe in and whom we put our trust in. God is in control. Amen. God is sovereign. And God is on the throne. And nothing happens in our lives outside of his purpose. And we have to remember that. Having said all of that, we still are going to experience in our lives problems. We're still going to experience situations. We're still going to experience heartaches and setbacks and disappointments. We're going to experience rejection. We're going to experience all of these different emotions. And that is what Solomon wants to share with us in chapter 3. So as we look at chapter 3, we see 3 things that Solomon pins down to help us reason through these questions. Why do bad things happen to good people who know the Lord? Why do I have to experience all the seasons of life? Who doesn't God heal? Why doesn't he heal them? And why does he heal others? Why did God allow so-and-so to die when I prayed my heart out that wouldn't happen? Why am I experiencing all of this pain in my life? Why have I had to endure disappointment after disappointment after disappointment in my life? So what we want to look at, the first thing, is some impressions of life that Solomon gives to us. And he starts out in the first 8 verses that J.D. read for us this morning. Life in general. These are 14 phrases that are alike in some ways. Actually, there are 28 statements. 14 are negative. 14 are positive. And Solomon tells us in these statements through his investigation and researching through it all that this is what life is all about. And he breaks it down for us. So watch this. This is our life. And our life is about time. Our life, when we look about it, he starts to look at it and he breaks it down. Body, soul, in spirit. That's who we are. And that's what he gives to us here. 29 times the word time is used during this passage of Scripture. So over and over again, he explains, and this doesn't include words like seasons or words like eternity or words like forever. But 29 times the word time is used here. And he starts out in verses 2 and 3, as we've read for you already. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck, what is planted. And then verse 3, he says, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up. Well, let's go back to verse 1, where he starts out and he says, to everything there is what, church? To everything. Not some things, not partial things, but to everything there is a season. A time for what? Every purpose under heaven. Now, what we've discovered in the first 2 chapters is life under the sun. And we've realized that life under the sun has no meaning. Life under the sun without God has no meaning. And we've also understood that it's vanity. It's empty. And that's what Solomon has shared with us. But those are problems without God. Now he's going to share with us problems with God. And he says, a time for every purpose under heaven. So what that means is, even while we're here on this earth, we're going to have a time of purpose in our lives. Purposes that are bad sometimes, purposes that are good sometimes. He says that. And listen to me. The reason why that is, ladies and gentlemen, is because we live in a fallen world. We live in a sinful world. And with sin, the penalty of sin is death. Okay? And we have to understand that. We are born in this world to die. What we do in our lives in between the time that we're born, the time that we die, is what God has given to us as a gift. But in doing that, He's done it with a purpose. So let's break this down real quick this morning, how we can do this. So let's go back to verse 2. Here's the boundaries of life. The first one is what? A time to be born. That's my baby. He was smiling when I said, Poppy's good looking. And you look like Poppy. He started smiling. There is a time to be born. When he was born, everybody kept telling me, when you have your grandchildren, it's totally different. The love for your grandchildren is totally different. It's a new kind of love. And when he was born, I couldn't fathom that. I'm sorry, I just couldn't, because I love my children so much. I couldn't fathom that in my mind, that there's another type of love. But when Bentley was born, you know, when Leslie was having the children, I was in there, every one of them. I was in there watching the birth and everything, and I was right by her side, and I was her coach, and I could do everything. But when Brianna went in labor, I couldn't take it. I couldn't take her being in pain. I had to get out of there. So I'm back in the waiting room waiting, for something to happen. And Leslie comes out, she says, it's about to happen, it's about, and I said, great, let us know. And she went back, she said, you're not going? I said, no, I'm not going, let us know. So she comes back out after the baby's born, and she comes in here and she gets 2 words out. She said, he's here, I'm like, is everything okay? Does he have all, 10 fingers? He has 10 toes. All of those things you go through your head. But there's a time to be born. But when I was thinking about that, there's also a time to die. Totally the opposite. The joy, the tears that we felt for Bentley and his birth, you start thinking of those that have faced death in the last week or so with your family members, the ones that you love. And there's tears that are shed at those moments, but they're tears that are different, totally different than when someone's born into this world. And that's what Solomon's saying. He's saying there is a time in our lives that birth is going to happen. People are being born, and then there's a time that people are dying. A time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted. And what he's saying is a time to harvest. There's a time to plant seed, and then there's a time to harvest. And you go on to verse 3, he says a time to kill and a time to heal. And you think about that, a time to kill, what does that mean? A time to heal. Well, do you realize that our bodies are changing all the time? Amen. They're changing all the time. One scientist said that our cells within our body die every 7 years and we replenish new cells. 7 to 15 years. But most of them are 7 years. And some of you are probably sitting there saying, I like my old cells better than my new cells. But the thing is that is what's happening, a time to kill. Our bodies are built to die. And they're doing all that. But there's also a time to heal. And that's what he's saying in here. And then there's a time to break down and a time to build up. Build up during our youth. Break down in our age. One preacher said this. He said, when you get older, time gets smaller and smaller. And steps get higher and higher. And people speak in lower and lower tones. That is so true, isn't it? But that's the way it is. In all the seasons of life, God is involved in all of that. Even death, yes. He is all powerful. He is all loving. And because we can't comprehend that, it doesn't make it not true. You understand? Just because we can't comprehend that God is in control of life being born and life dying out, because we can't comprehend that, doesn't make it not true. Because He's God and we're not. Nobody gets to be God. And then he goes on and he says He's intimately involved in every way from the very beginning to the ending. Every growth period of our life, every decline period of our life. He goes on, he says our life is in soul, how time affects the soul. And he goes on to verse 4. And he says the soul is the seat of the emotion. Solomon reminds us that there is a time to weep and that there's a time to laugh. There's a time to mourn and there's a time to dance. No one in this room or in this world can go through life without these emotions that we're talking about today. Sometimes you and I, we get together, we laugh historically. And sometimes we just cry. We understand that, right? We understand that emotion. We just cry. Sometimes we rejoice and we can hardly contain our joy. There is a time of rejoicing and there is a time of crying. And he goes on to say in verse 5. Verse 5. There we go. A time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones, a time to embrace, and a time of refraining, embracing. So in that situation, he's saying there's a time of affirming one another. And it's good, but there's a time when we need to confront one another. And affirmation would be complicity. Life is made up with all of these emotions that Solomon is talking about. And he's telling us that there's times in our life that we're going to face problems with God. We're going to face problems with God. And we're going to solve problems with God. And there's going to be times when we're going to have heartaches in our life. Things that we think that there's no way that we can bear anything else. There's no way that we can endure anything else in our life. There's no way that we can handle anything negative, anything that is there that is going to bring us down even more. We get to those points, but listen to me. My Bible tells me that God will never put on us more than what we can't handle. He knows our limitations. And if you're at that point where you think, I can't handle anymore, you better be ready. Because it's not your way or your time, it's God's. And God may bring you to the point where He wants you and He says, okay, that's all you can handle right here. So there's going to be times that we have that. And He's telling us that God is not just a God of good things, but He's a God of a part of all things. And we have to understand that. Then He goes on to say how time affects our spirit. And the spirit is our inner decisions. Our spirit is our deep commitments in our life. And this is where He gets into. He says in these verses in 6 through 8, He starts talking about sometimes we gain, right? We gain, and sometimes we lose. Now some of you are sitting there saying, yeah, we gain weight. But we never lose it. And we lose hair. We all know that. But there's times that we gain all of that. Sometimes we store things in our garage. He goes on to say, we store things, and then sometimes we clean house. We collect and we throw away. That's what He's saying. There are going to be times like that. And here's the one I like. Sometimes there's times when we need to speak, and then there's times that we need to keep our mouth shut. It reminds me of the older couple that went in to buy a car. They haven't bought a car in a long time. I mean, years. So they didn't know what the price was for a new car. So they go in and they talk to this young man. This young man's showing them all these different cars, and they come to this one car and they absolutely love it. I mean, absolutely love it. And they said, how much is this? And the young man looks at him and he says, that will be $99,000. And they're like, $99,000? And he says, yes. And the old man looked at his wife and he says, we need time to think about that. And the young man said, take all the time you want. Just come back and let me know. So they go away and they talk about it and everything, and they come back a couple days later and they come walking up and they notice this young, beautiful girl sitting in their car. So they go up to the young man that was there and they said, hey, what is she doing in our car? He said, well, it's been a couple days. You haven't let me know what you're going to do. I just sold that car to her. And they looked at him and they said, how could you sell our car? We were interested in that. He said, well, she came along. Look at her. I can't resist that. I gave her that car for $55,000. About that time, here comes that young lady, drives up in front of there, turns that car off, walks in, hands the old man the key and says, I told you I'd get the price down, Papaw. Sometimes we need to learn to keep our mouths shut. And sometimes we speak. Now don't go out and try that, okay? But I think about that. Here's another one. It says, there's a time to love and there's a time to hate. And some people say, how can we hate? It's not good to hate. Listen to me. Jesus hated. He hated sin. Jesus hated destruction. He hated corruption. He hated two-facedness. He hated hypocrisy. And we've seen that in that series that we talked about there. And there's nothing, to me, Thursday night we went out and we did our Barnabas group thing again, and we were feeding the hungry. And we had new people that came out with us, and they experienced what we've been experiencing with these people. And I was sitting there and I was looking at every one of them. And I was sitting there thinking, man, I said, I hate drugs. I do. I hate drugs. I hate what Satan has put into this world to destroy lives, to destroy marriages, to destroy children. You turn on the TV and you listen to the news, and it's one murder after another. It's one problem and arrest after another. This world is just full of it, and I hate it. Now, what we have to understand, there's a time to love and a time to hate. We can hate the sin. We can hate those type of things, but we need to love those who are experiencing it and going through it. And I was just watching our ladies Thursday night, and these one ladies that were there, and they're going through a very tough time, and I watched our ladies gather them up and have prayer with them, loving them. So there's a time to love, and there's a time to hate. And there's a time for war, and there's a time for peace. We've lived through both in most of our lives. All of life unfolds under the appointment of the providence of God. Both death and birth, growth and harvest, joys and sorrows, acquiring things and losing things, speaking up and being silent. God is sovereign and in control of all that happens in our life. Now here's the thing that we got to keep in mind. We may not like that, and we may not be able to fully explain that, but it's true. And Solomon recognizes it. Let me give you these passages of Scripture. How many of you, I don't want to see your hands, how many of you spend any time in Lamentations? How many of you spend time in Lamentations? Look at Lamentations. Here's a verse, these two verses that we find in this. It says, who is he who speaks and it comes to pass when the Lord has not commanded it? It is not from the mouth of the Most High that woe and well-being proceed. And you go on, and we go to the next one. What is it, 1 Peter? Or Ephesians? Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11. In whom also we have obtained an inheritance, being predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will. Do you see that? How much of what goes on in the world today that God is in control of? Whether we like it or not, He's in control of all of it. He's in control of all of it. God is in charge. And if you don't believe that, then you have a God that is not worth worshiping. If God is not in charge, He can't be God. Okay? He is God. And that's what we need to see. All of these things are a part of the plan of God that God has laid out in our lives. The difficulties and also the sailing through without challenges. That's what He's brought to us. But I want you to see this real quickly in closing. I want you to see, a lot of people stop after verse 8, but there's so much meat in the next few verses. I want to go through this with you real quickly. Let's look at verse 9 here. In verse 9, he asks that tough question that he's already asked 3 times in this passage of Ecclesiastes. What profit has the worker from that which he labors? And what he's saying here is this. What is left over? What is left over? After all of these seasons, what is left over? There is meaning to all of this. Okay? And that's what he's saying. Verse 10, he goes on to say, I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. And what he's saying is, man is so busy living out their lives, he won't understand the meaning of what God is trying to do in their lives. And what he's saying is, we get too busy in our lives sometimes to even reflect on what God is doing and why this is going on and what is happening. But here's the thing I want us to see. I want you to see verse 11, because this is where it gets so beautiful. Watch this. He has made everything beautiful in His time. Everything. Does it say some things or little things? It says everything's in His time. That takes us back to Romans 8:28. What does 8:28 say again? What does it say? And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. This is what you know what Solomon is doing? He is telling us of this verse before Paul even writes about it. He's telling us this in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Here's the problem. We have no problem with any of this unless it's bad. If things are going good in our lives, we have no problem understanding this. But when things start going bad, that's when we have a problem. And I like this example. There was a preacher who talked about how he brought the pianist back up as he was preaching. As he was preaching this passage of Scripture, he brought the pianist back up and he asked her to play Jesus Loves Me only in the white keys. So she played Jesus Loves Me in the white keys. Then he said, let's play it with the white and the black keys together. And then he asked the congregation, after everything was done, he said, which one of those versions do you like the best? And they all said, the second one, with the black keys. Do you know what the black keys are? The preacher said, they're sharps and flats. And they bring everything together beautifully. The music sounds so much more beautiful with it all together. You see, God's purpose is clear, and He gives that to us in the first part of verse 11. He says this, verse 11, also He has put eternity in their hearts, and we've already talked about that. That's where He's created us with that hole in our life, and we can't fill anything in that hole except with God. He's put eternity in our hearts. We were created for eternity. That's what we were created for. Okay? So he got that. And then he goes on and he says this. He says very clear. The cycles of life, the highs and the lows, the joys and the sorrows, they leave us with an ache for Him. And then he says in the second part, or the third part of verse 11, he says this, and this is pretty interesting. Except that no one can find out the work that God does from the beginning to the end. And he's saying that God's program is mysterious. Mysterious, pretty straightforward. He wants, we want answers all the time. God, He doesn't owe us an explanation of what those is. But let me give you this in closing. And here's the ones that you got to understand. He goes on and he gives us some instructions here. He's looking back over his shoulder and he's saying, hey, I told you that life is a life with God, but it also has problems. And he says this. The first one is, this is the one that gets us all the time. And that I've never seen it this way, except when I saw it this way in this week. Look at what it says. Look at the verse. Bring up the verse for me here. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives. Now the thing is a lot of times what happens is this. We're trying to figure everything out. We're trying to understand why God is doing this or why God is doing that, why God isn't doing this or why God isn't doing that. And we're trying to understand it. We're trying to be God in our lives. And what happens is, because we do that, we miss out on the enjoyments of life. Because we're trying to be God, we're trying to be something that we can't be, only He is God. He is sovereign. He is all-powerful, all-knowing, omnipresent in our lives. He's God. He knows all things. It's His ways. It's His timing. Yet we spend all of our time trying to figure that out. and we question him and we try to figure him out, that we miss out on enjoying life itself. And that brings us to verse 13. Don't forget to be thankful for God's gift to you. Everything that God has given to us is a gift. It's a gift. And then the last one is this, in verses 14 through 15. We don't need to fear life. We need to fear God. And you may sit there and say, well, I don't like God's plan for my life right now. Well, that's too bad. God doesn't have any red ink in the contract. He doesn't have any delete button. No erasers in heaven. No ways. You know, we got to get an understanding that this is God's way for our life. This is God's purpose for our life. Well, Pastor, life just isn't fair. It's not fair to me right now. Listen to me. Let me tell you of someone that's not fair. There was once a man who was perfect, who never sinned in his life. Never sinned in his life. He was a spotless, blameless Son of God. And one day God looked over at Jesus and he said, I need you to go down there and I need you to die for these people in whom I love. Jesus came down, spent 33 and a half years on this earth. And at the end of his life, he was taken and put on a cross. He was crucified. He was nailed. Sinless, spotless, perfect. Didn't deserve what he got. You talk about not being fair. But he did it because he loves you. He did it because he wanted us to experience life after death. That's what he wanted. You see, we're going to face so many things in our life. We're going to face the positive, we're going to face the negative. And that's what Solomon is saying. A life of problems with God. But understand this. God is in control. God hears your pain, or he feels your pain. He hears your cries. He's there. He's right there beside you, waiting for you to call upon him. Life isn't fair sometimes, but that's the meaning of life. We weren't built to enjoy everything down here. We were built for eternity. But in the meantime, the time between the cross and the crown, God has given us gifts, and the gift of life here, that we may enjoy it, and we may enjoy it abundantly. How are you living your life today? How are you living your life today? Let's all stand and bow our heads.